Got a black king glitter.
Imagine a pair of prophets dropping into a totally hostile world. But instead of bringing a message of grace or, turning the other cheek, they are breathing actual fire on their enemies. Welcome to a brand new deep dive.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense image, right? Because usually when you think about biblical ministry, you picture like a sanctuary.
Exactly. You think of a church setting. The message is safe, it's pastoral, and it's focused on peace.
Right. That is the default expectation for most of us. We're conditioned to view spiritual figures as these mediators of reconciliation. The whole operating system of the modern church is just entirely built on grace and mercy.
But then you step into the prophetic timeline of the book of Revelation. Specifically, we're looking at the landscape of chapter 11, and suddenly that peaceful sanctuary is just completely gone. The environment we're stepping into today is honestly violently tactical.
It's the absolute definition of a paradigm shift. The rules of engagement just completely change. And if you don't understand why that shift happens, well, the whole narrative can feel like chaos.
Yeah, and that's why today we are bringing you into one of the most fascinating and honestly often misunderstood mysteries in biblical prophecy. We're looking at the identities of the two witnesses.
It's such a great topic.
It really is. And to set the stage for you listening, we need to locate exactly where we are on the timeline. We are looking at the first half of what's known historically as Daniel's 70th week.
Right. And just to clarify that for anyone who, might not be super deep into prophetic timelines, Daniel's 70th week is essentially a highly specific 7-year countdown clock. It basically finishes the overarching biblical narrative for the nation of Israel.
Okay, got it.
So our focus today is specifically on the first 3.5 years of that final 7-year period.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive isn't just to pull names out of a hat. We're not just guessing who these guys are. We're doing a comparative study. We're going to analyze how the brutal, unapologetic ministry of these two witnesses starkly contrasts with everything you know about traditional church doctrine. We're going to look at first-century Jewish expectations, and we're going to piece together the specific biblical clues that point directly to two historical heavyweights, Moses and Elijah.
But before we can confidently identify who they are, we really have to look at what they do. Because, their actions completely shatter standard expectations of how biblical figures are supposed to behave in our current era.
Yeah, they really do. So let's drop right into the start of their ministry. The moment that 70th week begins, these two witnesses show up in Jerusalem, and they possess these distinct, frankly, terrifying supernatural powers.
Oh, absolutely terrifying.
The text in Revelation paints this vivid picture where if anyone tries to hurt them or stop their testimony, fire literally proceeds out of their mouths and devours their enemies.
Yeah, it's a lethal defense mechanism. The text leaves zero room for ambiguity. It basically says, if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. But their authority doesn't stop at calling down fire. They have the power to shut the heavens so that it doesn't rain for the entirety of their 3.5-year prophecy.
It's just a complete drought.
Exactly. And they have power over the waters to turn them to blood and the power to strike the earth with plagues as often as they want.
Okay, let's just pause and unpack this for a second. Because this destructive witness ministry is a massive contrast to typical church conduct. Like if you read the letters of Paul to the early churches, like in Philippians or Romans, the explicit instructions for ministers are to be harmless.
Right. Very clear instructions.
You don't get to call down fire on people who disagree with you. The church's role is much more like combat medics out on a battlefield, offering aid, healing, a way out.
I love that analogy. Combat medics.
Thanks. But these two witnesses, they sound like a supernatural SWAT team dropping directly into a hostile zone with zero rules of engagement. So if we look at this practically, why the sudden shift to extreme tactical warfare? Like, who are they actually representing?
Well, that is the crucial distinction that really solves the puzzle. The theological reason for this massive contrast in behavior is all about timing.
Okay.
By the time we enter this final 7-year period, the rapture has already occurred. The church is no longer on the earth, they're in heaven. Therefore, those specific instructions for the church to be harmless mediators of grace, they're simply no longer operative in the earthly narrative.
Wow. Okay, so the era of the combat medic is just over.
Precisely. What you really have to understand is that this final 7-year period has a distinctly Jewish identity and focus. And this separates these two witnesses from the broader church body entirely.
They're playing a different game.
Exactly. They are operating under an older, much rougher set of rules. It is a completely different dispensation, which is really just a theological term for how God manages different periods of history. So when their enemies give them a hard time in this era, they don't turn the other cheek. They play rough.
So since these witnesses are operating so far outside of standard church doctrine, it means we can trace their specific powers back to their origins. I like to think of these powers as, like, supernatural fingerprints left at a crime scene.
That's a great way to put it.
And when you map out the specific power dynamics, you know, the fire, the drought, the blood, the plagues, they link directly back to Elijah and Moses.
Yeah, the fingerprints are undeniable once you lay them side by side. Let's look at the first set. What is Elijah most famous for in the historical accounts?
Oh, Mount Carmel, right, calling down fire.
Exactly. On Mount Carmel, he called down fire from heaven to consume his enemies. That perfectly matches the defense mechanism of the two witnesses.
And then there's the rain. Or the lack of it, to be precise.
Yes. And the historical records give us a very specific detail about Elijah's ministry that is incredibly relevant here. Both the gospel accounts, like in Luke, and the early church letters mention that Elijah shut the heavens so that it wouldn't rain.
Right.
And if you look at how long he shut the heavens for, it was exactly 3.5 years.
Wait, which is the exact duration of the first half of the 70th week.
Exactly. The two witnesses show up for 3.5 years, and they have the power to shut heaven so it doesn't rain. The timeline is just a perfect match.
It ties together almost too well to ignore, honestly.
It really does. And then you look at the second set of fingerprints. Think back to the Exodus story. Who stood before Pharaoh and famously turned the Nile River into blood?
Moses.
Right. And who brought down a relentless series of devastating plagues upon the empire of Egypt.
Also Moses.
Yeah. The exact powers granted to the two witnesses are entirely unique and distinctive to the historical ministries of Elijah and Moses.
And what I found really fascinating while we were reviewing our notes for this deep dive is this concept of incomplete ministries.
Oh, yeah. This is key.
Because both of these men had earthly ministries. They were essentially interrupted, right? Moses was curtailed right at the border of the Promised Land. He wasn't allowed to cross over. His earthly work was basically cut short. And Elijah's ministry was also left incomplete when he was just dramatically taken away in a whirlwind, passing his mantle to Elisha before his work was totally finished.
Yeah, and the overarching pattern in the biblical narrative is that God doesn't really leave loose ends. If a prophet's specific divinely ordained ministry is interrupted before completion, well, there's a strong theological precedent that they will return to finish the job.
But, you know, if you're listening to this and nodding along, you might also be thinking of a major objection right about now.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Yeah, because when you dig into the source material, there is another candidate that a lot of people point to, the Apostle John. In the text of Revelation, John is literally told, quote, "Thou must prophesy again." Doesn't that make John a prime candidate to be one of these fire-breathing witnesses?
It is a super common theory, but honestly, it falls apart when you look the broader context of who John is. First, as we established, the Apostle John is part of the church. And the church has already been removed from the earth during this period. The witnesses are distinctly Jewish in their prophetic role, operating outside the church era. But even more compelling is a specific incident involving John during his time with Jesus.
Oh, this is the Sons of Thunder story, isn't it?
It sure is. So John and his brother James, they were actually willing and eager to duplicate Elijah's acts. They encountered some opposition in a village in Luke chapter 9, and they literally asked Jesus, like, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven and destroy them just like Elijah did?"
Wow, so that was their mood, just instantly to the fire.
Yeah, but Jesus expressly rebukes them for it. He tells them they don't know what kind of spirit they're operating under. John was strictly forbidden from operating in that kind of destructive Elijah-style ministry.
So to think that John would suddenly be granted the exact power he was rebuked for wanting earlier makes no sense at all. Like we said, the combat medic isn't suddenly handed a flamethrower.
Exactly. The roles are entirely distinct.
Okay, so John is off the table. But I want you to picture yourself in first century Jerusalem for a second. It wasn't just modern readers trying to match these supernatural fingerprints. The Jewish people of that era were actively anticipating the return of these exact historical figures, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. It was a massive part of their cultural and theological expectation. Really, it was the defining question of their day.
Right.
If you look at the historical accounts of that time, particularly in John chapter 1, there was a widespread expectation among the Jewish people. They were waiting for three distinct figures to arrive: Elijah, the Messiah, or the prophet of Moses, which was a promise dating all the way back to Deuteronomy 18.
So when figures like John the Baptist showed up, the authorities were literally walking around asking, are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? Are you the Messiah?
They were. Because they had these Talmudic expectations, meaning the ideas rooted deeply in ancient Jewish rabbinic writings and interpretations, the expectations surrounding the Messiah were largely derived from the final prophetic books of their scriptures, like Malachi, which explicitly predicted that Elijah would return before the final day of judgment.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Didn't some people think John the Baptist was supposed to fulfill that Elijah prophecy? Like, even some modern commentators suggest John the Baptist might be a candidate for one of the two witnesses because of his intense wilderness ministry.
Yeah, that's a fair question. It really is. But John the Baptist actually fails to fulfill the complete scope of the Elijah prophecy. The texts say he came in the spirit and power of Elijah, meaning he carried that same reformational energy, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But he didn't accomplish everything the ancient prophecies predicted.
Because the prophecy was conditional, right?
In a sense, yes. The prophecy stated that Elijah would turn the hearts of the children and usher in the great and dreadful day of judgment. But because the nation ultimately rejected John the Baptist's ministry and, allowed him to be executed by Herod, he didn't fulfill that specific role of ushering in that final day.
So he didn't cross the finish line of the prophecy.
He couldn't, because the people wouldn't receive it. That means the true, complete fulfillment of the physical Elijah prophecy hasn't happened yet. The role is still open.
Okay, so that totally rules out John the Baptist. But if we're looking at guys who have an open role, I have to bring up the elephant in the room. A lot of listeners are probably screaming this name at their devices right now. Enoch.
Ah, yes, Enoch.
The most common argument goes that the two witnesses have to be guys who never experienced physical death. Elijah never died. He was taken up in a whirlwind. Enoch never died. The text just says God took him. And people always cite the book of Hebrews to back this up, specifically the verse that says, "It is appointed unto man once to die."
Yeah, that is definitely the single most common pushback to the Moses and Elijah theory.
So let's figure this out. If Hebrews says man only dies once, and Enoch never died, isn't he a perfect fit? Why are we ruling Enoch out?
Well, this brings up a really fascinating philosophical and theological tangent about how we interpret these ancient rules, because people use that verse in Hebrews as a rigid, unbreakable biological law.
Right.
But if we look at the broader biblical record, are there people who died twice?
Well, yeah. I mean, Lazarus, for one, Jesus raised him from the dead after 4 days. He eventually had to die a second time.
And Lazarus isn't the only one. There was a young girl, Jairus' daughter, who was raised from the dead. There was the widow of Nain's son, who was resurrected mid-funeral.
Oh, true.
All of those individuals returned to physical life, lived out their days, and eventually died a second biological death.
So what you're saying is that the verse in Hebrews isn't a biological absolute about physical exceptions.
Exactly. It's a theological refutation of reincarnation. The general pattern of humanity is that a person lives once, dies once, and faces judgment. You don't come back as a completely different person in a new life, working off karma, but returning to your own physical body for a specific purpose. The text clearly allows for that.
Wow, that completely flips the argument. Because if dying twice is biologically and scripturally possible, then Moses, who definitely died and was buried, isn't disqualified from coming back to finish his job.
And beyond that, there are even stronger reasons to rule out Enoch. Remember how we discussed earlier that the two witnesses have a strictly Jewish identity for this final 7-year period?
Right.
Well, Enoch was a Gentile. He lived long before Abraham, before the nation of Israel, and long before the covenant was ever established.
So he doesn't fit the cultural profile at all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Furthermore, Enoch perfectly represents completely different theological model. He is actually the ancient prototype for the rapture of the church.
Wait, really? How does that typology work in the context of the literature?
Think about it this way. Enoch was physically removed from the earth before the devastating global judgment of Noah's flood. He wasn't protected through the flood. He was translated out of the environment entirely beforehand.
Oh, wow.
And additionally, ancient tradition holds he was born and translated on a specific date that correlates to the Feast of Pentecost.
And the church was born on Pentecost.
That is exactly the connection we should make. So Enoch typifies the Gentile church being rescued and removed prior to global judgment. Meanwhile, the two witnesses represent the Jewish remnant operating directly during the judgment. The theological mechanics of their roles are entirely different.
Okay, mapping Enoch to the rapture model makes so much sense. But this leads us to the ultimate logistical mystery of this entire deep dive.
Let's hear it.
If historical, prophetic, and supernatural evidence all point to Moses and Elijah, we have to answer the how. Elijah never died, so him showing back up is fairly straightforward. But Moses died. God buried him in a valley in Deuteronomy 34. How does a guy who has been dead for thousands of years physically return to Earth for a 3.5-year tactical ministry?
Yeah, to answer the mechanics of that, we have to look at one of the strangest, most mysterious verses in all of ancient literature. Just a single verse tucked away in the book of Jude.
The cosmic custody battle.
That's such a great way to put it. The text reveals this bizarre, almost incomprehensible conflict where Michael the archangel is actively contending with Satan over the physical body of Moses.
It's so weird.
It is. Now, this event isn't detailed anywhere in the ancient Old Testament historical records. We don't know the exact date it happened, but this text in Jude confirms that an archangel and Satan were literally fighting over a corpse.
Which is just wild to visualize. I mean, why would Satan care about the physical, decaying remains of Moses?
If you connect this to the logistics of the prophetic timeline, it begins to make perfect sense. Why did Michael need Moses' physical body? Because Moses needed to be brought back to physical life, just like Lazarus was, for his ministry in that 70th week.
Wait, I'm trying to think through the theology here. Why couldn't Moses just come back in a glorified heavenly body? Why does he need biological flesh?
Because the mechanics of resurrection in this theology are very specific. The ancient Old Testament saints don't receive their final, immortal, glorified bodies until the absolute end of the final 7-year period.
At the second coming.
Exactly. But Moses needs to operate on the earth during the first half of that period. So for him to interact with the physical world, be seen, and eventually be killed in the streets by his enemies, well, he needs a functional, physical, human body.
He had to be brought back to life in the exact same way Lazarus was.
Right, and that requires his actual physical remains to be preserved and secured.
So God sends an archangel to secure the asset.
That is the implication, yes.
Man, so what does this all mean for the timeline? Because if they knew this was coming, they must have prepared for it. And that brings us to the Transfiguration.
Yes, a crucial piece of the puzzle.
You have this famous scene in Luke 9, where Jesus takes a few disciples up a mountain and suddenly Moses and Elijah appear in glory, talking with him. Was the Transfiguration basically a divine strategy session? Like, were they literally planning out the tactical operations of the 70th week?
I tend to view the Transfiguration exactly like an elite staff meeting. The historical accounts give us a major hint about what they were discussing.
What does it say?
The text says they spoke of his, quote, departure that he was about to accomplish. But Peter, who was standing there and deeply impacted by this meeting, later writes in his own letters with strong allusions to this event.
Okay, so he's remembering what was talked about.
Right. The suggestive impression from the combined texts is that Jesus, Moses, and Elijah were having an extended discussion, specifically coordinating the events surrounding the final timeline and the second coming.
They were syncing up their schedules.
They were coordinating the unfinished business. Think about how perfectly all these pieces fit together. Moses and Elijah both had incomplete earthly ministries. They are the only two men in history who perfectly match the supernatural fingerprints. You know, the fire, the drought, the blood, the plagues of the witnesses.
It's all there.
Exactly. The Jewish nation was specifically expecting their return based on ancient Talmudic writings. And God went to the extreme lengths of having an archangel secure Moses' physical body just so he could stand on the earth again and finish his job.
It is a perfectly interlocking puzzle. And for you listening, I really hope you see why diving this deep into the mechanics of the text is so valuable. It's so easy to get hit with information overload when you read ancient, dense, prophetic literature like Revelation.
Oh, absolutely. It can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, you see beasts and fire and plagues, and it just feels like random chaos.
Right, without the historical context, it's just too much.
But when you grasp the why and the how, when you see how perfectly the ancient prophecies, the cultural expectations of first-century Jerusalem, and the New Testament revelations all interlock, it cures that overwhelm. It transforms what seems like a confusing read into a thrilling, incredibly coherent blueprint.
Because nothing is random.
Exactly. The gritty, violent reality of the timeline rules out the church. The supernatural powers act as historical fingerprints, and even an obscure sentence about an archangel fighting over a body reveals the extreme logistical lengths taken to set the stage for their return.
When you take the time to understand the overarching narrative, the text truly opens up. The intentionality behind every single detail becomes just undeniable.
It really does. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today, something that builds on this cosmic puzzle we just put together. We talked about that strange conflict in Jude where Michael the archangel was fighting Satan for the physical body of Moses.
Right, the custody battle.
Yeah, the custody battle. If Satan was willing to go toe-to-toe with an archangel over a buried body way back in the ancient world,
Yeah.
does that imply that Satan already knew the prophecies we've been discussing today?
Now, that is a profound question to consider.
Like, was that custody battle actually a desperate, preemptive strike by Satan?
Yeah.
Was he attempting to destroy the physical body of Moses, to completely sabotage the timeline of the final 7 years before it could even begin?
Wow. That really changes how you look at it.
It really makes you read those ancient texts with a whole new level of respect for the unseen war going on behind the scenes. Keep digging, keep questioning, and we'll see you on the next Deep Dive.
Thanks for joining us on this hour, on the Archive Hour. Join us on our next hour as we bring you more adventures from the Bible.